This is what I've been asked to talk about, producing cultural content for museums, how to stay refreshing. I imagine that we're from all sorts of different groups and different sectors in the room today, but I suppose the thing that probably unites everybody is that there is content of all sorts in the institutions and places and venues that you represent. What I'm not going to do is try and tell anybody what content to produce, but what I hope I can do over the next few minutes is give a bit of an insight into, in the context of museums and galleries specifically, how museum directors, gallery directors think, and that therefore how influences the sort of content they're looking for and trying to develop. And hopefully some of that is transportable, transferable across to other sectors. I know there's at least one of my former colleagues at the National Media Museum in the audience today, so that's a bit of a guarantee that I will tell the truth about the story, even though I left there about 4 months ago, and I'm now doing some other things which I'll come on to later. When I was thinking about this, I found this picture which rather appealed to me. It's obviously from quite some time ago. I'm not quite sure exactly when. It's York Museum in the background with a wonderfully long snaking queue of people waiting to get in. I wasn't able to find out what it was that they were getting in for, but it obviously must have been quite good. I suppose the reason for sharing that is that one thing I feel really strongly about is that whatever anybody tells you, particularly about museums, visitor numbers do matter. The reality is that I suppose most museums in this country actually are publicly funded. They're not commercial businesses, most of them. But despite that, as a museum director, what did I ever wake up in the night worrying about? I didn't actually, but if I had, what would it have been? It would have been the visitor numbers. And if the visitor numbers are sort of, nice or going in the right direction, I felt good about it. And if they were looking a bit dubious, I was going around with a long face a lot of the time. Now, so, whatever anybody says, visitor numbers matter, even in publicly funded museums. Now, of course, there are lots of other key performance indicators for museums and galleries other than their visitor numbers. The way in which a museum is developing its collection, the way in which it's making its collection accessible to people, and a whole host of other objectives. And of course, it isn't just about the raw visitor numbers, it's about the nature of that audience and whether it's reaching different sections of the population, etc. So, visitor numbers are not the only thing, but I think, being blunt about it, they matter, and that is the thing that, certainly in my experience, most museum directors are not entirely fixated on, but fixated a lot of their time on. We've referred to the Olympics. I was quite lucky actually in the Olympic ballot. I applied for a ridiculous number of tickets, thinking that if I get these, I'm going to go bankrupt, but fairly certain that I wouldn't. But I got 3 lots, and I was lucky enough actually to see Usain Bolt. That's my picture. That's the closest I got to Usain Bolt. That's my picture, just on the curve coming around the 200 metre. There were heats actually, not the finals. But I mean, I think it's relevant in this sense. Why did 80,000 people pack into a stadium on a Tuesday morning in August, on the day that I was there? Indeed, 80,000 packed in pretty much every day. And I suppose there are 2 things really. It's about the chance to be in the presence of greatness, of somebody, in this case iconic, and it's also about being part of a sense of occasion and being part of an event. And that's why that's me heading towards the Olympic Stadium, me taking a picture of people heading towards the Olympic Stadium. That's my wife in the front. It was absolutely packed in the Olympic Park. People were thronging towards this stadium. Now, of course, the Olympics is a one-off, and it won't happen again in our lifetimes in this country, I don't suppose, unless there are some really young people here. And museums and galleries, don't have Usain Bolt, but they do have iconic objects, be they works of art or great works of science and technology. And they can, I think this is the really important thing, they can create a sense of occasion. They can create that sense of an event. And indeed, they can create iconic events and objects and experiences. So I think the Olympics, is a bit of a lesson for all of us. What are my credentials for talking about this? Well, I ran the National Media Museum in Bradford for 8 years until April of this year. And for those of you not aware of it, It's a national museum. It's part of the Science Museum group. So the Science Museum in London, the National Railway Museum in York, the National Media Museum in Bradford, and quite recently also the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester has become part of that group. It's a free entry, essentially taxpayer funded, arm's length from government, Board of Trustees, etc., National Museum. It was set up in '83, and it is consistently been one of the most visited museums outside of London. Actually, I think my favourite story about the time, one of my favourite stories about the time I was there was, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years ago. And of course, like all museums and places represented here today, we made a bit of money by hiring out our spaces and facilities. And there was a particular occasion when a very well-known international organisation rang the sort of corporate hire team of the National Media Museum in Bradford and said, we're interested in holding a conference, So the bump was sent and a provisional booking was made. And a few weeks before this was supposed to happen, somebody from this well-known international organisation rang the corporate hire team at the National Media Museum in Bradford. Said, by the way, we're just sort of finalising the details. Can we just check, what's the nearest tube station to the museum? And there's a sort of assumption that anything with the word national in it must be in London. And one of the great challenges and one of the great opportunities of running a place like the National Media Museum is the challenge of sometimes getting around to people's perceptions about national institutions that are not based in London. But I'm going to start off, if I may, and go off on a bit of a complete diversion, but I think it is relevant to what we're talking about today. And to show you these two dubious characters, if those of you who are from Yorkshire, you may recognise them as Krista Ackroyd and Harry Gratian, the presenters of Look North, the BBC's regional news programme in this part of the world. Because previously I worked for the BBC for 24 years, like a life sentence, before I went to the museum. And my last job in the BBC was head of the BBC Yorkshire region. And actually the main challenge I faced when I took over that job in 1997 was the performance of the BBC's regional television offering in this part of the world. In most regions in the country at that point, still the case now actually, the BBC tended to be the market leader. The BBC got bigger audiences than the ITV equivalents. And also the approval ratings of the BBC, so two main measures I suppose, sheer audience numbers and something which the BBC calls approval ratings, which is a slightly more nebulous measured thing about how warm people feel about the BBC in different parts of the country. And perhaps not surprisingly, people feel very warm about the BBC the closer they are to London. London, the South East, and the soft southern underbelly of this country, the BBC is very, very popular. As you get further away, up here it gets a bit colder. Scotland, it's pretty chilly, and in Northern Ireland, it's positively freezing. So one of the challenges for me was how we turned this around in Yorkshire. And I mean, it's a bit of a long story, so I'm not going to tell you the whole thing. But basically, the lesson I learned from it is that you have to do big, bold things. And the two big, bold things that we did in relation to the performance of the BBC in this region were to change the front end, as it were. Most people's relationship with TV programmes is built largely around the presenters. And so I decided that we need to change the presenters. So I persuaded Harry, who some of you may know, had gone off in exile down south somewhere to do various slightly dodgy things, to come back. And then a couple of years later, after 2 attempts actually, managed to persuade Krista Ackroyd, who I know is not everybody's taste, by the way, but she consistently scores one of the most popular presenters in this part of the country when people survey people on these things. Persuaded Krista to jump ship from the opposition and come over from ITV to join the BBC. It was very amusing, actually, looking back on it, the whole process. And we met clandestinely in various hotels around Yorkshire. There was probably some rumour about the fact we were having an affair. We weren't. And I remember actually the first meeting we had, it's all about trying to woo somebody. I think we met at the Trust House 40 in Brighouse, because it was quite near where she lived. And I booked a room, not a bedroom, a room, to sort of have this meeting and organise some wine. And it was supposed to be 7:30, and she was supposed to turn up. And it got sort of 7:45, and she hadn't turned up. I thought, she's bottled out. She's not going to do this. It got to 8:00, and I was about to give up a ringer to say, look, And suddenly, I sort of looked out of this room and could see coming down the corridor one of the most recognisable faces in Yorkshire, wearing a ridiculously large pair of sunglasses to try and disguise herself. Anyway, she turned up, and after various other meetings in various other hotels, we poached her in what I was delighted to see the Yorkshire Post described as one of the greatest broadcasting coups ever. I thought, well, that's not bad. The rest sort of is history, because the combination of doing that, of changing the presentation team, and also delivering a greater degree of localness, because one of the great challenges of regional television is it's sort of, the regions are a bit big, and how do you maintain a shared regional identity with, people in Whitby and people in, Chesterfield, and was to actually deliver a more regional, a more localised service. So actually there are now two versions, as some of you will know, of Look North, one based in Leeds and one based in Hull. And the combination of doing that completely transformed the audience position vis-a-vis ITV, almost literally overnight. I mean, it didn't quite happen overnight, but in a very short period of time, from a position where ITV had about 60% more audience than the BBC, to a position where the BBC's audience was 2.5 times that of ITV. And that position has pretty much actually been maintained. I think the gap's not quite as big now, the best part of 10 years later. Now, the reason for mentioning that is not to sort of show off about something I did, but just to say that I think, television is a very specific area, I suppose, of thing. But I think that there's lots of small things you can do, and there were some other small things we did to try and change the position. But in the end, you have to sort of grab hold of something big to really make a difference in terms of turning around perceptions of an organisation or a product, and therefore getting more people to come and consume it in some way or other. So back to the museum sector. I mean, I suppose the big difference between, say, my experience at the BBC and coming to the National Media Museum is that, in a sense, the enemy at the BBC was very easy to identify in that context. It was ITV. You knew exactly who they were, where they were, and what they looked like. In the museum sector, the enemy is sort of hidden in the undergrowth a bit more, really, because it's multifaceted. It's not just other museums. It's all sorts of other things, shopping centres, what's on the television, and a whole range of other things, as you'll all be familiar with. But nevertheless, I think there are some parallels, and I'll come on to those. I mean, just a very brief sort of description, because some of you may not be familiar with it. The National Media Museum, 7-8 floors of pretty interactive galleries, the whole history of television encaptured in a gallery, and lots of interactive experiences where you can read the news, and you can play at being a television director and all of those sorts of things. 3 cinemas, including what was the very first IMAX cinema in Britain, and which are run as a sort of, effectively as a commercial arm of the museum, run separately, obviously charged for, as opposed to the rest of the museum, which is free. A very well-developed programme of special exhibitions that run in 2 sort of temporary special exhibition galleries, and a very new development, actually, and the thing that happened just before I left earlier this year was the creation of this thing, which is Life Online, which is the first museum gallery in the world telling the story of the history of the internet and the web. 3.5 million media heritage objects of one sort or another in the collection. About 3 million of those are photographs. But I think a lot of people don't realise that, down the road in Bradford, lost my bearings, we have what is probably regarded by most people as in the top 3 photographic collections of significance in the world. And the only other place in the world that rivals the television collection is the Smithsonian in the States. So, this is a very, very significant collection right here in the heart of Yorkshire. Now, this is the sort of nub of what I really want to talk about, which is simply my experience of the visitor number story during the period I was at the National Media Museum. And as a couple of my former colleagues are here who can testify, I'm probably sort of uniquely placed in a way to talk about this, because I counted the numbers up, I counted them down, and just as I was leaving, and since I've left, I've seen them starting to go back up again. So I'm actually going to look at each of those periods and just give you a very brief, my explanation of why numbers went down, why numbers went up, because I think there are some lessons from that. I mean, just it's not a terribly good graph, but basically the far left is the year 2000, and this is up to now. Now, actually, if we went right back to the beginning of the museum opening in '83, the sort of average line is about there. Went right back there. It's about 600,000 is the average. That top one's just shy of 1 million. Now, the reason there were 1 million people visiting in the year 2000 was because the museum had been shut for about 18 months, completely refurbished. It was a Millennium 16 million refurb, which brought lots of new things. And also, there were 2 real blockbuster exhibitions that happened in that year, one of which actually I had something to do with, even though I wasn't at the museum at the time, which was a thing called Future World, which was a big Millennium digital project about the digital future, which went around the country. And there was also a Bond exhibition there during that year. So that was a bit of an outlier, to be honest, that million. But when I joined, which was 2004, which is 3 or 4 dots in, the numbers were on the slide a bit. And they had been from that Millennium high point. And I think there were 2 principal reasons why the numbers were going down. One was that there hadn't been a big, new, shiny thing. And, one of the very simple, obvious, but nevertheless important lessons, certainly in museum land, is that, you open a new gallery, you get some attention, people come and see it, and sort of until you open the next new big thing, you're perhaps fighting a bit of a trend after a while. And, of course, in the meantime, somebody else close by will have opened another big, shiny new thing down the road, and that'll have got attention. And from 2000 until 2006, there were basically there were no significant additions or alterations to the gallery portfolio of the museum. And the other thing was that in 2001, as you will remember, there were some very serious riots in Bradford. And that undoubtedly had an impact. I mean, I wasn't there at the time at the museum, but I know that, for example, going back to corporate hire, there were a whole rash of cancellations of corporate hire bookings at the museum. I mean, it's totally irrational. The riots were absolutely nowhere near the museum. But nevertheless, obviously it impacts on all institutions in Bradford. I suppose the point about that is there are certain things you can't control in whether numbers go up or down, and things like riots are one of them. So we get to 2006, which is sort of roughly in the middle of there, and the numbers start going in the right direction. And between 06 and 09, they went up by just short of 25%, which was pretty good. So how did that happen? Well, I think there were 3 main things. First of all, there was a big, new, shiny thing. In the summer of 2006, we opened a thing called Experience TV, which there previously had been a gallery in the museum about the story of the history of television, but it was quite out of date. So there's a big updated version of the history of television. And we also changed the name of the museum. Some of you will know that the original name of the museum was the National Museum of Photography, Film and Television. But after a lot of debate, some opposition from various quarters, including some of our trustees, I persuaded them to change the name to the National Media Museum, partly because the previous name was a bit of a mouthful. I think somebody had once got it in the right order on a Tuesday afternoon in February 1998. And also because, our vision for the museum was that actually it should become more all-encompassing around other aspects of rapidly changing media. And you couldn't really sort of add to the list the National Museum of Photography, Film, Television, Radio, the Internet, Uncle Tom Cobley and all. So we decided to go for National Media Museum. Although changing a name itself, I don't think draws in loads of visitors, it did, of course, get us some attention, which was important. And then the third thing that influenced those numbers going up during that period was a very specific thing, I suppose, about the museum, which was to do with the IMAX cinema. I mean, everybody assumes that the IMAX cinema must be some fantastic cash cow, etc. It's actually a bloody nightmare a lot of the time. And the economics of IMAX are quite scary, but that's a whole other separate talk. However, what happened in sort of 05, 06 was that, of course, people were producing a lot more feature films in 3D. Previously, the stock in trade of the IMAX cinemas generally, was the sort of 45-minute specially made journey to the centre of the earth type, journey underwater type films. And whilst we carried on showing those, there was then an opportunity, if we invested in some extra projection kit, to show Harry Potter in 3D. So we did that, showed Harry Potter in 3D, and the summer we showed, I can't remember which Harry Potter film it was, in 3D, we had an 80% occupancy across all screenings in the IMAX cinema that summer, which is phenomenal. But and then we had sort of 2 or 3 years of Avatar and another Harry Potter film and another Harry Potter film and various other things, and there was a bit of a golden period. And then from 09, they started going down again. So why did they start going down again? Well, partly it goes back to the no new big thing. Despite lots of efforts, we had plans for creating our new gallery about the internet, but it took much longer than we'd hoped to get the money, so it was a long period of time. Bradford's image, I don't think it got any worse, but it certainly didn't get any better. So we were operating in an environment where lots of people had lots of preconceptions about, why would I want to go to Bradford? And we lost that. We had a window of opportunity which closed much more quickly than we expected in relation to the 3D feature films, because, as you all know, you can watch 3D film in pretty much any cinema in the land now. And that unique opportunity we had disappeared more quickly than we expected. Now, actually, it's much better watching it in an IMAX cinema because it's a bigger screen than watching it in your local Odeon. Nobody here from Odeon, isn't there? But, it's difficult to market that and sell that differentiation. And then, finally, just as I was leaving, the numbers, we had last year wasn't a good year, but actually this year so far, I gather, although I can't sort of really claim the credit, they're moving in a better direction. Yeah, somebody's just nodding who works at the museum, so I'm glad I've got that right. And, I'm sure part of the explanation for that, there are various things, is the fact that there has been another new big shiny thing, that gallery about the internet, which opened in March. So what sort of lessons do I draw from all of that? Well, as Bill Clinton famously said about what determines the outcome of American elections, it's the economy, stupid. I mean, it is the content, stupid, in relation to museums. You've got to have stuff in the museum. It sounds a terrible statement of the obvious, but stuff in the museum which actually is interesting and attractive and relevant to the people you're trying to attract. But there's a lot of context that you can't control. In a place like Bradford, as an example, there are lots of challenges about Bradford, and that influences whether people want to come to the museum. And the weather, one of my former colleagues, who's a slightly sort of anal interest in the relationship between weather and visitor numbers, has this wonderful graph, which I tried to get hold of, but I couldn't, which plots the relationship between temperature in Celsius, rainfall, and visitor numbers on particular days over a 5-year period. And there's almost an exact relationship. In the case of an indoor visitor attraction, bad weather, good news. Although if the weather's too bad, of course, that's not good because people won't venture out if it's snowing and all of that. Now, obviously, there are people in this room who come from organisations where the exact opposite is true. Good weather, good news. But, we all know there's a direct relationship and you can't do much about the weather. And, there are other factors in terms of the wider environment. I haven't even mentioned the recession, but I'm sure there must be some connection between the fact that the numbers at the National Media Museum went down during a period of recession. Yes, it's free entry, but people have still got to spend money to get there, etc. So there's all of that. And it's also, about the competition, isn't it? And, I suppose only over the period of time I worked there, I gained an understanding of, who is the competition. And the competition, you can't write it all down on one slide or one sheet of paper. Of course, it's some other neighbouring attractions, our competition. But it's Meadow Hall Shopping Centre or the White Rose Shopping Centre or, what's on television. And some of those things you can try and counteract, but some of them, you can't, in reality, do much about. So, my conclusion after the experience of both the BBC, which I accept is a different environment, but also the museum, is that, big things count. You have got to be bold. You've got to be quite brave. Some of these things can fall flat on their face. You can spend a lot of money on big gallery and, you don't get the numbers. You can spend a lot of money and time on hiring a new presenter and, the audience don't like it. They did in this case, so that's all right. But it is about doing big, bold, brave and perhaps slightly brash things, which some people, what are you doing that for, at the time. Now, of course, alongside that, there are lots of small steps that also matter. I remember once, I think it was the opening of one of the film festivals at the museum in Bradford, and my wife came to it, and I'd made a speech about all the great things the museum was about to do, and afterwards she said to me, it's all very well you're talking about all these new plans. What you need to do is get the toilets clean. There's a sort of hygiene factor thing, isn't there, about all visitor attractions, which we forget at our peril, and you can wreck all these brilliant plans and these big bold things if the sort of day-to-day things, the visitor welcome and the basic things like toilets and signage and all of that aren't right. But, in the end, I think it's the big bold things which will get museums and other organisations noticed. And that, of course, is about making a big noise about it as well. And I'm just going to sort of quickly work through a few things that happened while I was at the museum. Not all of them I can claim credit for, but I think they're examples that perhaps illustrate what I'm talking about. And one of the things I think the museums can do really successfully is create events. You know, you don't have to wait for things to come along. You can create them, and actually you can piggyback on other people's brands to do this, and do it quite unashamedly, actually. And you know, going back to the U.S. presidential election analogy, you know, I believe that in reality, to win the U.S. presidential election, you need to win Florida, New York, California, I don't know, a couple of other states. It doesn't really matter what happens in Rhode Island. And it's true of museums as well, isn't it? You've got to get the numbers you want. You've got to do well at February half term, you know, October half term, Christmas, blah blah blah. And it sort of doesn't matter what happens in the third week of January too much in terms of the overall numbers. So one of the things that we certainly tried to do more aggressively in the time I was there was to really concentrate on the offer being delivered at the half term school holiday periods. And February of this year, brilliant success with Moshi Monsters. If I'm honest, 6 months before February half term, I hadn't even heard of Moshi Monsters because my kids are a bit too old for that. But they are a big online sensation, as many of you will probably know. And some of my colleagues successfully persuaded Moshi Monsters to come and do a big thing over February half term. And lots of people flocked. So, you know, that's an example of that. And going back a few years, we had another great day, which I will always remember at the museum, back in 2010, where we broke the Guinness Book of World Records record on the number of people playing Nintendo DS in the same place at the same time. Now there's a thing. And I think 5,000 or something people came in a day, which is a big number for the museum. And they all had to do doing this, and that was great. And so that was another example of a sort of created event. And then, I don't know, one of my favourite things about from the National Media Museum, and there's a bit of a contradiction in this, which I will explain in a minute, is something called the magic carpet, which some of you who may have been there years ago may remember. But this was basically an exhibit which showed how sort of chroma key technology works on television, you know, blue backgrounds and all of that to float on magic carpets. And actually, in 2006, when we revamped the television bit of the museum, we got rid of it and replaced it with something else, which was supposed to achieve the same thing. But for years afterwards, and it's probably still happening after I left, I said, what have you done with the magic carpet? And it's one of those things which, you know, became iconic. So it was an entirely created thing. This was not an object from the collection of the museum. It was entirely created, but it became iconic and had a sort of interest and a legacy, actually, many years after it had been got rid of, such that at some point, I can't remember when it was, but in the last year, we actually recreated it during a half-term thing as a sort of nostalgia thing, actually, because a lot of parents, I used to come here and, you know, went on this when I was a kid. So, and there are other things, you know, for example, the Archimedes bath, sort of in the entrance to Eureka. There are certain things, aren't there, which are, you know, interactive or created objects in museums which obtain sort of iconic status. So my conclusions are: big things count. This is all about offering unique experiences. You know, building big new shiny galleries is really important for museums and will continue to be important for museums. But you can't build big new shiny galleries every day of the week because there simply isn't the money there. So you have to sort of create things in the interim which will draw people in. The hygiene factors are important. Some things you can't control, so don't worry about those. And whatever you do, you've got to make a noise about it. And then if you translate that in terms of, well, what's the actual content that we need to be looking for? I've mentioned some examples of interactives that can become themselves iconic. So I think the iconic content of museums is not limited to the objects in their collection. Obviously, the objects in their collection are the most important things, but you can create that iconic feel about certain things if you get it right. You know, I had lots of discussions over the time I was at the museum with people who came with ideas for, you know, why don't you do this? Why don't you have that? And I think the key thing is, it's got to be a good idea, but also it's got to really relate to the core content of the museum. And there is a danger, and I've seen examples, and I'm sure we all have, of people who've, as it were, imported something which doesn't fit what the museum or gallery is about, and that doesn't work either. And then I think increasingly, you know, it's really important to think about the creation of interactives for finite periods of time. You know, we are living in a more pop-up society, aren't we? And, you know, I think the reality is that whatever happens to the economy over the next few years, the number of big new gallery developments we will see in museums is going to be far fewer than it was over the last 10 years. It doesn't mean we should abandon the idea of doing this, we shouldn't, but a lot more, if you like, pop-up content will be relevant. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope that is relevant to the organisations that you work for in some way or other. And in the spirit of making a noise, just to promote myself for a moment, it says on my badge, former Director of the National Media Museum. I've been described as former. I'm more interested in what I'm doing now. And I'm doing various things, actually, but one of them is sort of offering myself as a consultant, and that's my website and all of that. So if you're interested, please take a look. Thank you very much. Thank you.